Hi. I wanted to make a little bit of a different video from what I usually make. It's been a very long time since I've made a video. A lot has happened, but this is not going to be my normal channel video where I just pretend to care about this channel for 10 minutes. I actually want to talk about, something that has kind of come up in my life recently. As many of you know, I am now a game developer. I used to really want to be a filmmaker, and that's what a lot of this channel was. But for the past probably year now, I've basically fully transitioned to making video games full time. It kind of started as like just this fun little side hobby, like, oh, I'm not really passionate about this, but you know, it's fun. And then it kind of evolved into something that I realize I genuinely have much more of a talent for than I do for filmmaking. And to be honest, I kind of started to enjoy it more for that reason. So that's just kind of a brief introduction. This is going to be about like game development stuff. So if you're not interested in that, then feel free to keep watching actually, because you might be surprised. But otherwise, leave. Um, Now I have this series, as I'm sure many of you know, called Battery Chad. It's on my Game Jolt page, which should be linked in the description. Feel free to check it out. Please God, it's like the one place where I actually am active on the internet anymore. Um, and in this Battery Chad series, there is Battery Chad Builder and Battery Chad Builder 2. Those are kind of the main games right now. Battery Chad Builder 2 isn't out yet. And here's the thing, these two games are very fundamentally different because Battery Chad Builder is a lot like Super Mario Maker. Very much same basic concept. It's a platformer game, you build levels, that sort of thing. And Battery Chad Builder 2 is extremely similar to that, except instead of it being a platformer game, it's a top-down game. So you move in four directions, and you don't go jumping around and stuff. It's more like Zelda than Mario, for example. And that has brought up a somewhat troubling conflict, which is for the vast overwhelming majority of games that I've developed, they have been platformers. And the thing is, um, I find that there is a very huge difference between platformers and top-down games for a lot of reasons that I want to talk about. And a lot of this comes from the fact that I am currently trying to design a lot of top-down levels after spending almost my entire game development career entirely making platforming levels. Uh, so here's the thing, and I've made a lot of platforming levels, right? Just between the games that I've made that are platformers and just making stuff, messing around in Mario Maker and stuff. You know, I've probably made a good few hundred platforming levels in my day, and according to the feedback I get, I'm decently good at it, which I'm quite proud of. Or at least I would be if I didn't, honest to God, think that it was just so easy. And I'm not trying to say this to brag. Hear me out. I think that there's a lot of things that make making platformer levels a lot less complex and a lot generally easier than making top-down levels. If you've ever played a Mario game, then you know what platforming levels generally are. And just for reference, this entire video, when I say platforming or platformer, I'm referring to 2D side-scrolling type thing, not 3D platformers. I'm not, I'm trying to do that at some point, but not yet. Um, the thing is, with platformers, one thing that you'll notice right off the bat is that a large, very integral part of what makes them enjoyable is just controlling them. Just moving your character around. Just jumping around and being athletic, essentially. And it's kind of because of the action aspect of it. But just moving your character around in and of itself, at least if, you know, the player physics and whatnot are programmed well, is generally fun. You know, just booting up a 2D Mario game and moving around and jumping around as Mario mindlessly can be fun in and of itself. Um, and that's not true with top-down games. With top-down games, You're kind of put onto this field and you can move in any of four directions. And that's not in and of itself fun. And I kind of wanted to explore why that was, and one of the conclusions that I was brought to is just simply the fact that in side-scrollers and platformer games, it's a lot more athletic and it's a lot more actiony because, you're jumping up and down and you're fighting against the gravity, and the gravity in and of itself serves as somewhat of an obstacle, right? So even if it's just something as simple as jumping over blocks or, um, you know, avoiding a pit, it still feels inherently like you're doing something cool or important just by moving around. That's not really the case with top-down games. With top-down games, um, it's kind of like, moving a mouse cursor around. Like, you can move it wherever you want, but then if the second you let go of the mouse and you leave it there, that's where the mouse stays. Similar with characters in top-down games, right? You can move them wherever you want. Once you put the controller down, that's where they stay. That's not necessarily true with platformer games. If you jump up into the air and then put the controller down, your character falls down. And that also brings to the point of the way that levels are designed. Now, as I mentioned before, I honestly think that platforming levels are just generally something that are very easy to develop. And here's the thing. At the end of the day, a level in a platforming game is essentially just a glorified obstacle course. When you're going into making a level for a platforming game, really all that you have to do is you have to make some sort of way for the player to get from point A to point B in a way that is fun to do in and of itself, even if it's something as simple as putting some blocks for them to jump over and some enemies for them to defeat and stuff like that. And that doesn't translate to top-down games so well. The closest you can do to that with top-down games is, I guess, if you just put enemies around and, put some sort of maze-type thing or some sort of, blocks with gaps, but that doesn't necessarily feel inherently fun just to do. In fact, it feels kind of like a chore or like filler or something. And you'll notice if you play top-down games versus platforming games, you'll notice a lot of things that top-down games employ that you almost never see in a platformer game. Because again, a platformer game is essentially a glorified obstacle course, with blocks of stuff to jump over, stuff to avoid. Maybe the occasional new mechanic or cool thing like that is introduced, and you interact with that or trigger or activate something and make a thing do a thing. But at the end of the day, you get the point of what I'm saying. It's basically just get from point A to point B and make it enjoyable for the player. And with top-down games, you might notice something that's a lot more common is things like puzzles or, fetch quests. For those who don't know, fetch quests is basically like, oh, go get the item and bring it back to me, that sort of thing. Another thing that you'll notice with top-down games is that the way that they're designed usually is a lot more sprawling. With a lot of platformer games, essentially it's just a straight line, right? Again, point A to point B. It's just a straight line for the player. But with top-down games, they're kind of these giant sprawling maps, and a lot of the time they're designed in a way that very much encourages you to explore them, and they're designed, to inherently be enjoyable and interesting to explore. And the reason for this is because, going back to the whole thing about movement, in platforming games, movement, again, in and of itself, should be fun. It's a large integral part of what makes playing a platforming game fun. But with top-down games, not so much. In fact, with top-down games, moving around is a lot more just kind of a mode of transportation and nothing else. So a lot of the time, to try and make that process a lot more painless, game devs will try and design levels in a way that are actually fun to explore and to traverse, and at least make the scenery interesting, so that while the player is, trying to go from point A to point B, and move around, it doesn't just feel like they're, walking a marathon. It doesn't feel completely boring because they have something to look at. And the thing is, hang on, the thing is that, I think a good way to describe it is platforming games are very much kind of just like this mindless thing. It's kind of almost like junk food for the brain. You can shut your brain off. You can pick up a new Super Mario Bros. Game on your DS or whatever, and you can practically play it with your eyes closed. You could be watching TV or something in the background and still be playing the game. It doesn't really require much thought. It's very thoughtless, and that makes it, that mindlessness of it is what makes it so accessible. You can give a 2D platforming game to somebody anywhere from a 3-year-old child to a 98-year-old grandmother, and they'll probably be able to not only play it well, but have a phenomenal time doing so. And again, that's because of that accessibility of it being very mindless. Everybody knows what to do. You just get from point A to point B, and you have fun doing so. And that, again, doesn't really translate with top-down games, because top-down games, movement isn't inherently fun. Getting from point A to point B isn't inherently fun, so they have to try and put something in there to make that interesting, to make you want to do that. Usually, the biggest thing is a story. But aside from that, as far as the actual gameplay goes, that you'll see stuff like puzzles and, fetch quests, and basically, you'll notice a pattern of top-down games being a lot more thought-provoking than platformer games. And top-down games, essentially, being a lot more involved. Going back to the example of playing a Mario game while you're watching TV, you probably couldn't really do that with, for example, a top-down Zelda game or something, unless you're barely watching the TV at all. Because that's a lot more involved. You have to really focus on it. And that also translates to developing it. Of course, if it's more thought-provoking and involved to play top-down games, you can only imagine how much more thought-provoking and involved it is to try and develop those levels and, make that sort of thing. And really, it all comes down to formula, right? The thing about platformers is that you can very easily nail it down to a formula of how to make levels, even very similar levels, that don't feel repetitive to play over and over again. And you can't really do that with top-down games, because the things that top-down games have to employ to make them fun, things like puzzles, things like, quests, if you don't shake them up, if you don't make them different, it feels like the same puzzle over and over again. It feels like you're just doing the same thing over and over again, and you lose motivation to even play the game. That doesn't really happen with platformers because, again, platformers are kind of like junk food. They're very mindless, and that makes them a lot more fun, even if they are somewhat repetitive, to just keep going. A great example of this is, earlier I mentioned my Battery Chad series. Well, the first game in that series was Battery Chad Shock the World. It's an NES platforming game. And essentially, it's an extremely simple game. There's basically just one repeating enemy over and over again. And then there's a solid tile collision, a death tile collision, a ladder tile collision, and a health pickup tile collision, and like a collectible coin type of thing. And those just repeat over and over again with different skins, and that's basically the only things that there are to build up the levels. And originally, Battery Chad Builder, the Mario Maker type game, launched with only those items as well. And that's why that game, at launch, in my opinion, was probably one of the worst games I ever made. My thought process at the time was, oh, well, if I can use this bare bones tile set to create this fun game, a la Battery Chad Shock the World, that doesn't get repetitive with just these items, then surely anyone else can be able to. And there's a couple of problems with that inherently. The first one is that isn't really fun to make levels like that. And the whole appeal of something like Mario Maker is that you can really make it your own, and you can experiment, and you can combine things that, might not usually be combined, and certain things will interact with each other in really neat ways. And you can use that to be really creative and make really awesome stuff and crazy contraptions and whatnot. And that is the entire appeal of something like Mario Maker. Now imagine if Mario Maker instead was just the items from Mario Maker, the items from Mario Bros. 1 on the NES and nothing else. So you have like ground and bricks and coin blocks, but you can't put anything in them except power-ups and Goombas and like Bowser, and that's it. Like, yes, Super Mario Bros. 1 exists, and it's a fun game that was built only using those pieces. But if they make a game that's supposed to make building levels fun and they only include those items, all you're going to be able to make is Mario Bros. 1. You can't really put your own spin on it, you can't really be creative with it, you can't experiment, and at the end of the day, it's just not fun to make levels with that bare bones type of thing, and I wasn't thinking of that at the time. Now, through time and with updates, eventually Battery Chat Builder became probably one of my proudest games that I've made. If not the proudest, and that's because I actually realized the problem, and I started adding stuff, and I made stuff that can interact with each other, and I'm not necessarily sure if I'd say it ended up on Mario Maker's league, but it's still somewhat comparable, and it's definitely not nearly as bad as it was when it started out. But the point that I was originally trying to make with this is that Battery Chad Shock the World is made with an extremely bare-bones tile set, and so is something like Super Mario Bros. But the thing is, those games are still fun to play, despite the fact that fundamentally the levels are extremely repetitive, because the formula works. It's something that you can just kind of mindlessly play, and the levels, even though they only change in, mostly small ways, sometimes even just purely aesthetic ways, they're still... In fact, Mario Bros. 1, fun fact, actually outright has a few levels repeat. There aren't actually 32 unique levels in Mario Bros. 1. I don't remember exactly how many there are or how many are repeated, but I know that levels repeat. A good amount of levels repeat. And a lot of people didn't even notice that until years and years later. And again, the thing about that is because inherently that's the nature of a platformer game. It's mindless. You're not really thinking that hard about the level design while you're playing it, and it can kind of be nailed down to a formula. And of course, there are games that really go above and beyond with it, like, for example, Celeste. Probably one of the best games I've ever had the privilege of playing. Seriously, get it. It's on, like, the Switch and the PlayStation. It's on, like, every console, get it. And that's an example of, really going above and beyond. But at the end of the day, you don't need to do that to make a game that will captivate people. Obviously, it's nice, but you don't need to. And that doesn't go for top-down games. With top-down games, you really have to put a lot of thought into it. Because with top-down games, if the levels are repetitive, unlike with platformers, the player is gonna notice. Because top-down games are supposed to be thought-provoking, whereas platformer games are supposed to be mindless. So when you're playing a game mindlessly, you might not notice little things like levels repeating or being repetitive because you're just having fun mindlessly playing the game. But when you're actively being involved and trying to think about the game, you're going to notice, hey, this feels like the same thing twice, and I don't like that. Now, Battery Chat Builder, again, probably one of my favorite games I've worked on, has a campaign mode, and it is 55 levels long, which is not only a testament to how far the game has come, but it's also a testament to, again, how kind of easy it is to nail platforming levels kind of down to a formula. Now, the thing is, with Battery Chat Builder, more campaign modes actually came out as new items were added, and that really worked in its favor because I think, by far, the best thing that especially a platforming type game can do to make the levels consistently captivating and, like, really actually involve the player is if it constantly introduces new mechanics throughout, and doesn't dwell on them too much, but, still introduces a new mechanic that gets you thinking about how you can use that in a certain way. And while that really only happened because the campaign modes came out as the new features did, it still really worked in its favor. And I think that Battery Chat Builder actually works just as good as simply a campaign-based platformer as it does a level editor, if not even more as a straight campaign game. It's definitely leagues ahead of the NES game that it's based off of. And so, of course, with Battery Chat Builder 2, I wanted to have another campaign mode. But the thing is, it's a lot harder to try and design top-down levels, especially when you're trying to design them in kind of a formulaic way, because that doesn't really work. I'm sure that there's some way out there to do it, but it's probably in a very niche sort of category, you know? And it can't just be applied to every top-down game under the sun. With top-down games, you really have to put a lot of thought into the design, and you have to make sure that they don't get repetitive, because otherwise the player is just going to think that they're playing the same thing over and over again. And nobody likes doing the same thing over and over again in a video game. Trust me, I've played Mario Make 3DS, I know. So I've kind of reached this conflict where I'm really trying to figure out a way of either how to make top-down levels with some sort of formula, or how to actually make top-down levels that don't feel repetitive with the limited tile set I have, which is such a bigger problem with the NES game, because I don't know if I mentioned this, but the Battery Chad games come out with one retro game and then one builder game. So Battery Chad Shock the World and Battery Chad Builder came out on the same day. Then Battery Chad Builder 2 is coming out alongside Battery Chad Top-Down Turmoil, which is basically a top-down Battery Chad NES game. And basically, like, the thing is, the builder games are for PC, so there's not really any limitations. The NES, I'm not sure if you know what an NES is. It's this thing back here. It's not crazy powerful. It's from 1985. I'm pretty sure that the Famicom actually dates back to earlier than that, and the Famicom is just the NES, but in Japan. It's an extremely old piece of hardware, is what I'm getting at, and it's extremely underpowered. And that's a large part of why I adore it so much. I like working under restrictions because it breeds creativity, as you always hear. But with the NES, it can be especially hard to work with when you're trying to make a more complex game, like a top-down game. With a platformer, again, it's super easy to just have a very bare-bones tile set and still be able to make a cool game out of it. But with a top-down game, it's a lot harder, especially when you're limited to, you know, something like a tile set. And again, top-down games tend to heavily rely, if there's anything that they rely on, number one, the most, it's a story. Because even with all that gameplay stuff that I already mentioned, if that was just the way that it was on its own, there would really be no incentive to play that on its own for a lot of players. A lot of players with these top-down, you know, puzzle-type games, play them because they're interested in some sort of overarching story, and they're invested in it. And that's how a lot of, you know, for example, the Zelda games work and whatnot. Whereas, obviously, with something like a Mario game, you're definitely not in that for the story. Or at least if you are, something's probably wrong with you. Unless you're playing Paper Mario. Paper Mario is an exception. But, you get the point I'm making. And I'm still debating whether this game should really have much of a story or not. And that's a whole other complicated thing that I won't even get into. But it's really kind of opened my eyes to this, you know, large alienating difference between these two types of games, the platformer and the top-down game. They're very much polar opposites. The one thing that does work as a formula that you can do with a top-down game that I discovered a while ago is a collectathon. And for those of you who don't know, collectathon is basically a game where you collect a bunch of stuff. Now, many of you remember a few years back I made this horrible, very bad series that you should not watch called Formula Fanboy Infinity Bit. And I made a few NES games based off that, and those were top-down games. But the way that they worked is basically there were these 8 little bits, they were called, scattered throughout each level, and what you had to do was you had to go and explore the level and collect all of them, and then go to a certain area to progress to the next level once you had all of them. And that is the one thing that I found that works as a formula for these top-down sort of games. The thing is with that kind of formula at the end of the day, it can get repetitive fast. So two things that you need to be really good at is having an interesting environment to explore, make the level actually fun to walk around. Otherwise, it's just going to feel like a chore, which I nailed with the first few levels in that game and not so much the last few. And second, you're going to want to have, even if you don't necessarily have an overarching story, you're at least going to want to have some sort of character or comedy going on, or some sort of witty dialogue to please the player. And with Infinity Bit, that was very easy to do because it's based off of a TV show, so I just had to make references to the TV show. But the thing is, with this game, I very much didn't want to go that route. I didn't want to do a collectathon. Why didn't you want to do a collectathon, Formula? I'm so glad you asked. Because I've done it so many times. Basically, every top-down game I've developed has been a collectathon, except for the Infinity Bit movie game, and that one is kind of like an odd one out. It works differently, and it definitely would not translate to what I'm doing here. Basically, you like talk to NPCs, and then you unlock more areas and stuff, and somewhere in there was basically a collectathon in a very thin costume. That's a story for another day. The thing is, Battery Chad Top-Down Turmoil, while it is right now my main priority to get it on the NES, originally, the only reason why the idea of a top-down game in this series ever even came into my mind was because at the time that the idea materialized, I was really into this project that I was working on called Gimmick Programming Language. I think I've talked about it a few times. Basically, I made a programming language, and it's kind of bad, but considering the restrictions that it was made under, it's pretty impressive. And I kind of made it restricting on purpose so that it would, you know, kind of emulate the feeling of making an NES game or something like that back in the day. The thing is, it can only do like a top-down sort of thing. Basically, it's not like most programming languages. When you load in, there's already like a character that you can move around and like a background. And then the coding stuff, you can change what that character looks like, and you can change, you know, what the level and the backgrounds are like and all that stuff. Originally, the only reason why the idea of a Battery Chad top-down came to mind was so that I could make a Battery Chad game for Gimmick Programming Language, because I wanted to have a lot of games for that. Since then, I've really lost a lot of interest in the Gimmick Programming Language project. And that's in part just because nobody used it. But it's in part just because after a while, you know, I got back into developing Battery Chad Builder, and that's when all those updates happened, and I realized, ooh, developing things under not crap restrictions is actually really fun. And now I'm at this point where I'm kind of debating if I even want to still make the Gimmick version, despite the fact that that was the whole point of this game existing in the first place. And right now I'm settling on, yeah, I'm probably going to make it. Like, I'm at least going to try to make it. And it will definitely be the worst version of the game. But that was the whole reason why I wanted to make a top-down game. And the thing was, this game was kind of supposed to show the power of what the Gimmick programming language engine could do. And I had already made a good few games that were just outright collectathons with this engine. It's definitely the easiest type of game to make with it. It's just a collectathon similar to Infinity Bit Falling to Bits or something, which is the game I was talking about earlier. But the thing is, this Battery Chad character is basically the mascot of my game development. So obviously, I don't want to make a game with its brand that is the easiest type of game that you can make that's already been done a billion times on that programming language. That would be like if, you know, Nintendo released a new console with a Mario game that absolutely showed off none of what the hardware could do. Oh, right, New Super Mario Bros. U. You get the point, though. Like, the whole idea of this game is basically to show off the power of this engine that I have. And I've already made several collectathon games as launch titles for it. So, I don't want to just make the easiest thing that I can. I want to do something that really shows that you can get crazy and make unique stuff with this thing. And I've gone through many ideas of of what I want to do with the gameplay for this game. One of them was like a fetch quest sort of thing where you'd have to get an item, bring it to a character, and then they'd give you an item, bring it to a character, yada yada yada. Um, but that turned out to not be possible for the NES version, and of course I have to make an NES version. I made all this. I made like a soundtrack of like 90 something songs for the NES. There's so many songs I have to split the NES version into 2 ROMs because I can't fit the soundtrack that I made on 1 ROM. And I'm not letting all that go to waste. There is absolutely going to be an NES version. So then I tried to think, well, how can I make, sort of like this puzzle-solving type top-down game into some sort of formula. But then I realized you can't really develop that into a formula the way that you can with a platformer. And there have been several times where I've just outright considered making it a collectathon the way that I've done with a billion other top-down games. But the problem with that is that I've done that so many times, and I feel like it would be a disgrace to this character to be that lazy and to just slap the brand of this thing that's supposed to show my capabilities as a developer, because this brand is basically supposed to be like the thing that represents my entire game developing career. I would feel really bad just making something that was super easy to make, and fairly lazy, lazily put together because I couldn't think of anything else, just to get the game out. And that's the thing, is Battery Chad Builder 2 is almost entirely done. Like, I haven't made the campaign mode, but that's basically the only thing that isn't there yet. Almost all the items that I'm pretty sure are going to make it to the final game are there. All the UI is set up. It's basically a complete game. And it has so much stuff at launch that Battery Chad Builder 1 should have. And that's really cool. But it kind of feels like it's being held hostage by the NES game that I still haven't developed because I can't figure out how to make these levels for this game. So here I basically have a completely done game, and I want to release it on the same day as its companion game for the NES and for Gimmick and all the rest of that stuff. And I've already basically accepted that I'm going to release the NES and the Builder game on the same day, and then I'm going to release the Gimmick version, like, a lot later. Gimmick is not very fun to code for. Well, it can be fun, but, like, for someone like me who's impatient, not so much. Technically, I am a programmer, but I'm not a very patient one. So, there's kind of this conflict in my head of, well, I really, really just want to get the game done so that I can release them both, so that I can release this one game that I'm super proud of that's basically done, and be able to launch it with his companion like I did with the first thing. And it's August. The last 2 games launched in September of 2019, so if I'm able to get them ready by September, I could actually have them launch around the 1-year anniversary of the first generation of games, which would also be really cool. And I know for a fact I'm putting myself on a deadline to at least get it out by 2020. But the thing is, I kind of have this conflict in my head where, again, I just kind of want to get the game out. But by the same token, I don't want to rush it and make, a cheap, lazy game just because I'm so enthusiastic about launching this other game. I don't want to push that other one to the side, especially when it's supposed to be a big part of the brand that represents me. And especially, I kind of owe it to myself several months ago when Gimmick was my big project at the time. I kind of owe it to that version of myself to actually make something that can show off the capability of the programming language that I made, because it can actually do some really cool stuff, and none of the programs that I've made for it demonstrate that. And God knows nobody else is making programs for it. I noticed this thing where I make Discord servers for my projects and my games and whatnot, and I get a ton of members, and none of them ever actually contribute anything. Like, there's a... And that's totally fine, I'm not going to pressure people into doing that, but, like, there's a Battery Chad server where you can share your levels, and from the Battery Chad Builder games, there was a Gimmick server where you were supposed to submit, so with the Battery Chad stuff, at least people actually did send levels occasionally. It's extremely rare, but it did happen. With Gimmick, I'm pretty sure literally nobody ever actually sent a script or even a sprite or anything at all that they made with Gimmick. And I remember back then that really upset me. Like, I made a programming language. I was so proud of that. That's probably still one of the most impressive things that I've done in my life. And just nobody used it. But everyone was willing to join this Discord server. That's what got me. They were willing to join this thing that was supposed to be a community for sharing stuff you made in it, and then nobody made anything for it. And you just have a bunch of inactive users on a server. And it's like, why did you join? You know? And I don't know. It's kind of this whole conflicting thing where, you know, I don't want to rush the game. I don't want to make a rushed game. To quote Miyamoto, a delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad. Despite the fact that I'm pretty sure Majora's Mask was extremely rushed, but that's not the point. The point is that if I rush the game, if I do something like, oh, I'll just make a collectathon and slap Battery Chat on it. Yeah, that'd be easy. And yeah, it'd probably save me a lot of stress, and it would definitely get the game done quicker. But it would be a cop-out, and it would be a disappointment not only to myself, but to the, like, 3 fans of Battery Chat that actually exist. And yeah, Battery Chat Builder 2 would still be really cool, but the other one would just be so half-assed that it would be like, you know, it's an entirely one-sided effort, and I don't want that to be the thing that happens. But then again, I'm really want to force myself to release this thing by 2020, at some point in 2020, and I definitely want to get it done soon, because again, I have Battery Chat Builder 2, which is basically entirely done. I want to show it off. I want people to enjoy it and appreciate it. I think in a lot of ways it's even better than the first one, and it kind of feels like it's being held hostage by this other game that I'm just completely, you know, what's the word? Like creator block or something like that. I'm just completely burnt out on what I'm actually going to do for it. And I don't know what to do, what kind of gameplay formula to develop, focus camera, that would A, be possible on the hardware I'm making it for, and B, result in an actually fun game to play. And if worst comes to worst, I will just have to make a collectathon and try and make it the best collectathon I've ever made. But that's if worst comes to worst. And that's what I'm going to have to do if I can't finish the game by 2020. So, I don't know. This kind of turned into a video talking about game design between 2 different genres of games, to me just breaking down about this internal conflict I'm having. But it does kind of all intertwine, because I've been thinking about all this a lot because of this situation I'm in with these games that I want to release. So I have to think about, you know, how the game design for the game that I'm trying to make would even work. And I may have gotten ahead of myself by deciding to make this type of game, and by even making Battery Chat Builder 2 in that style, before thinking, wait a minute, how am I going to make this work? You know what I mean? So, I don't know. This was kind of just like a meltdown of all my thoughts in complete random bleh. But at the very least, it wasn't the type of video I've literally been making for the last over a year, where I just stand in front of the wall and say nothing for 10 minutes. I hope this was at least remotely entertaining to some of you. Again, at some point in time eventually in my life before I die, I plan to make some sort of actual content for this channel that's actually edited and scripted and whatnot, and I have no idea when that's going to be. Please visit my game jolt and play my games. It's like the one thing that I actually do with my life now. There will be a link in the description to my Game Jolt page. Please play Battery Chat Builder. Please do all that stuff. It's really cool. Make a Game Jolt account if you don't have one. It's much better a website than YouTube. The staff actually listens to their users and, like, implements stuff to make them happy. It's like, let me pitch to you what Game Jolt is, okay? It's basically Twitter, uh, but for video games, and without all of the toxic people that are on Twitter. Mind you, that doesn't mean it's completely free of toxicity at all whatsoever, because no place on the internet is. But, it's a pretty cool place. So if you don't have a Game Jolt account, please consider making one, especially if you like video games. It's a very cool place. And be sure to go to my profile if you do that. Alright. I'm gonna end this train wreck of a video now. Goodbye. How long has it even been since I've made a video? Probably too long at this point. Oh yeah, I got a haircut.